Pirates were masters of food storage, though you wouldn't expect that from a bunch of sailors who thought sword fighting was their quality entertainment. These sea-loving troublemakers actually had some clever tricks up their sleeves for keeping 300 hungry men fed during their long ocean adventures. Let's start with the ship's most important storage tool, barrels. These wooden containers were engineering marvels, built watertight enough to hold rum without a drop escaping and sturdy enough to stack 3 levels high in the hold. Each barrel was a feat of craftsmanship, with wooden staves bent and shaped just right, metal hoops holding everything together, and special techniques to make them virtually indestructible. Pirates sealed them with pitch and tar, coating every seam and joint to create fortresses that could protect food for months at sea. The biggest barrels could hold up to 50 gallons, which meant one barrel could feed the crew for days, assuming the food inside stayed good. And those barrels were put to good use with their primary preservation method, salting and brining. Now, if you've ever accidentally swallowed a mouthful of seawater, you've got a pretty good idea of what most pirate food tasted like. They'd take perfectly good beef and pork and essentially mummify it in salt. The meat would end up so hard, you could probably use it as a cannonball in a pinch, though I suspect that would have been frowned upon by the ship's cook. The process was actually quite clever. They'd soak the meat in a brine solution so thick you could practically float a ship on it. This turned the meat into something resembling a salt-preserved rock, which they stored in barrels in the lowest parts of the ship. Why the bottom? Because it was the coolest spot, sort of like a primitive refrigerator, minus the ice maker and annoying door alarm. But salting wasn't their only trick. Drying food was another favorite method, though it required a bit more patience and a lot more sun. Meat, fruit, and fish would be laid out to dry until they looked like they'd spent a year in the desert. The resulting food was about as appetizing as your grandmother's leather handbag, but at least it wouldn't kill you, usually. The dried goods were stored in sacks or wooden crates in the driest parts of the ship, which was crucial unless you wanted your food to turn into a science experiment. Speaking of food storage, pirates had a rather unusual living pantry system. They'd carry fishing gear, harpoons, and nets to catch fresh food when possible. But here's where it gets interesting. They had a particularly creative way of storing sea turtles. They'd flip these poor creatures on their backs and keep them alive that way for weeks. It's like having a living refrigerator, though I doubt any modern food safety inspector would approve. Then there was pickling, the pirates' version of a food preservation system. They'd stuff barrels full of fish, vegetables, and eggs, then drown everything in vinegar. The good news? This killed all the bacteria and could keep food edible for months or even years. The bad news? Everything tasted like it had been marinated in your grandfather's old boot polish. A historical record from 1718 mentions that one pirate crew actually preferred eating their boots to their pickled provisions, though that might have had more to do with the cook's skills than the preservation method. Here's a fact that might make you appreciate your modern kitchen. Studies of recovered pirate ship provisions showed that the average salt content in their preserved meat was about 10 times higher than what we'd consider edible today. This means that eating pirate food was basically like licking a salt block with a side of leather. But the impressive part of these preservation methods wasn't just that they worked, but that they allowed pirates to stay at sea for months at a time without having to risk stopping at ports where they might be recognized and arrested. Though I imagine after a few months of eating salt-cured everything, getting arrested might have started to seem like a decent alternative. At least prison food had some variety. And speaking of variety, there was one food item that pirates dreaded more than any other. Something so tough and unappetizing that it became a legend in its own right. Hardtack, the notorious ship biscuit that could break teeth and spirits with equal efficiency. If you've ever bitten into a cookie that's been left out for too long and thought, "This is a bit stale," well, hardtack would laugh at your definition of stale. This wasn't just any ordinary cracker. It was more like edible cement, designed to outlast the ship itself. The story of hardtack begins with a simple problem. Flour doesn't last long at sea. The damp, salty air turns it into a moldy mess faster than you can say scurvy. So pirates, being the resourceful rogues they were, turned to these indestructible biscuits. The recipe was simple enough. Flour, water, and maybe a pinch of salt if you were feeling fancy. That's it. No sugar, no butter, no hope of enjoyment whatsoever. Archaeologists actually found some hardtack from an 1852 Arctic expedition that was still technically edible. I say technically because while it wouldn't kill you, it might make you wish it had. This discovery proved what sailors had known for centuries. Hardtack was basically immortal. It could survive anything except perhaps a direct hit from a cannonball, and even then, I'd put my money on the hardtack. The biscuits were stored in barrels or cloth sacks, which sounds normal enough until you realize they weren't alone in there. Weevils, those tiny beetles that loved to make homes in grain products, were such common residents that sailors had a dark saying, 2 bites of hardtack, 1 for you, 1 for the weevil. The standard practice before eating was to bang the biscuit on the table, watching as the uninvited guests came tumbling out. If you were lucky, they'd all fall out. If you weren't, well, extra protein never hurts anyone, right? The truly remarkable thing about hardtack wasn't just its durability. It was the creative ways sailors found to make it somewhat edible. The most popular method was called dunderfunk, where they'd break up the hardtack, mix it with whatever fat they could find, and fry it all together. It was still terrible, but at least it was warm and terrible, and sometimes that makes all the difference. Some particularly desperate crews would soak their hardtack in coffee or rum to soften it up. This had the dual benefit of making the biscuit chewable and getting a bit tipsy in the process, though drinking the liquid afterward was considered an act of either great bravery or profound foolishness, depending on who you asked. A single ship might carry thousands of these biscuits for a long voyage. They were stacked like bricks, which was fitting since they had roughly the same consistency. There's an old sailor's joke about a captain who ordered his crew to build a temporary repair to a damaged hull using hardtack. The repair outlasted the ship. Despite its legendary durability, hardtack became a symbol of the sailor's life. Some pirates even kept a single biscuit as a good luck charm, though distinguishing between a good luck charm hardtack and a regular hardtack was probably impossible. They both looked like they'd been around since the beginning of time. When you really think about it, hardtack was the perfect metaphor for life at sea. Hard, unforgiving, and full of surprises. Most of them unpleasant. But just like the sailors who ate it, it got the job done, no matter what. Speaking of getting the job done, pirates needed more than just these dental-destroying delicacies to survive. They had to figure out clever ways to store their other dry goods. While barrels were the heavyweight champions of pirate storage, not everything needed to be sealed up like King Tut's treasure. The real brilliant part of pirate storage came in their use of crates and sacks, a system so efficient it would make modern logistics managers jealous. Barrels were fantastic for wet storage, but they had one major drawback. They were heavier than a conscience after stealing your sister's Halloween candy. Empty barrels could weigh up to 30 pounds each, and that's before adding anything to them. Pirates, being surprisingly practical for a bunch of people who thought wearing eye patches was a fashion statement, figured out that lighter storage options made more sense for certain goods. Canvas sacks became the go-to storage solution for items like rice, dried beans, and dried peas. These sacks could be squished and squeezed into odd spaces, unlike barrels which were about as flexible as a grumpy sea captain. A typical pirate ship could store about 40% more dry goods by volume when using sacks instead of barrels, a fact that probably saved more than a few crews from having to resort to eating their leather boots. The real art came in how they stacked these items in the hold. It wasn't just throwing things wherever they'd fit, despite what you might expect from people who considered buried treasure a legitimate banking system. They developed a sophisticated stacking system that would put a game of Tetris to shame. Heavy crates went on the bottom, medium-weight sacks in the middle, and lighter items on top. This wasn't just about organization, it was about keeping the ship balanced. A tilted pirate ship is about as useful as a chocolate anchor. But these storage areas needed constant monitoring, and I mean constant. Every few days, some unfortunate crew member had to climb down into the hold and check for 3 deadly enemies: mold, rats, and water leaks. Finding any of these was bad news, but finding all 3 was basically the storage equivalent of hitting the panic button. Rats were particularly problematic. A single pair of rats could produce up to 15,000 descendants in a year. Pirates developed some creative solutions for this, including keeping cats on board and storing dried herbs like mint around the food stores. Some crews even designated a rat watch, probably the least popular job assignment in maritime history. The crates themselves were often lined with lead or tin to protect against moisture, which might sound dangerous until you remember these are the same people who thought drinking rum for breakfast was a good idea. They'd also pack dried sage or bay leaves between layers of goods as natural preservatives and bug repellents. It actually worked pretty well. When archaeologists excavated a sunken pirate ship from 1722, they found some surprisingly well-preserved dried goods in crates that still had traces of these herbs. To keep track of everything, pirates developed a surprisingly sophisticated inventory system. Each sack and crate was marked with a simple code that even illiterate crew members could understand. A circle might mean rice, a square might mean beans, and so on. It wasn't exactly Microsoft Excel, but it got the job done. Despite all this careful organization, there was always that one crew member who couldn't find anything. Every ship had one. The guy who could somehow lose a crate of beans in a room full of clearly labeled crates of beans. Some things never change, whether you're in a modern office or on a pirate ship. But even the best organized dry goods wouldn't keep a crew alive without one crucial element. Water storage on a pirate ship was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot in the desert. You'd think being surrounded by an endless ocean would solve the water problem, but unless you enjoy a nice tall glass of salt water with your morning hardtack, the sea wasn't much help. Pirates had to become expert water managers, even if they preferred their drinks with a bit more kick to them. The main water storage system involved massive wooden casks, some of them big enough to hide 3 pirates playing cards when they should have been on watch duty. These weren't your average barrels. They were specially treated with pitch and tar to seal every possible crack. A typical pirate ship needed about 1 gallon of water per person per day, which meant a crew of 300 would need, well, let's just say math wasn't a pirate's strongest subject, but it was a lot of water. The largest water casks could hold up to 500 gallons each. To put that in perspective, that's about the same amount of water as 10,000 cups of tea, though any self-respecting pirate would rather walk the plank than admit to drinking that much tea. The real problem wasn't storing the water, it was keeping it drinkable. Even in sealed casks, water would start to go bad within weeks. It would turn green and slimy, develop a smell that could knock out a seagull mid-flight, and grow things that probably should have been classified as new life forms. The pirates had a charming term for this transformation. They called it going rusty. That's putting it mildly. Going catastrophically disgusting would have been more accurate. To combat this, pirates developed some creative filtering methods. They'd pour the questionable water through layers of cloth, charcoal, and sand. Did it work? Well, sort of. It was like putting a fancy Band-Aid on a broken leg. It might look better, but you're still not winning any races. Some crews added a splash of rum or vinegar to kill the taste, which is a bit like solving a bad hair day by shaving your head. Effective, but perhaps not the ideal solution. A particular trick involved adding wine or brandy to the water casks when they were first filled. The alcohol helped prevent bacterial growth, though I suspect this was less about science and more about pirates looking for any excuse to add alcohol to anything. Sorry, Captain, I had to add rum to the mop water. For sanitation purposes, of course. The water situation got so desperate sometimes that crews developed elaborate systems for catching rainwater. They'd rig up their sails like giant funnels during storms, directing the water into their casks. This probably seemed like a brilliant idea until someone realized they were basically collecting water that had just washed all the bird droppings off their sails. But hey, desperate times call for desperate measures. One of the most amusing aspects of water storage was the hierarchy it created. Fresh water was more valuable than gold on a long voyage, and the captain's private water supply was guarded better than the treasure chest. There are actually records of pirate crews mutinying not over unfair shares of plunder, but because the captain was hoarding the good water, which, by most standards, was still pretty terrible. The ultimate solution to bad water? Don't drink it. This brilliant strategy led to the massive storage of alternatives, particularly rum and beer. After all, if you're going to drink something potentially dangerous to your health, it might as well be something that makes you forget about your problems. And speaking of forgetting your problems through the strategic application of fermented beverages, that brings us to perhaps the most important storage category on any pirate ship. Rum and beer were treated with almost religious reverence. When you're stuck at sea eating salted meat that could double as a ship's anchor, a good drink becomes more than just a luxury. It's practically a human right, and pirates took their drinking rights very seriously. The storage of alcohol on ships wasn't just about keeping the crew happy, it was actually a brilliant survival strategy. You see, alcohol lasted way longer than water without going bad, and it killed bacteria that might make you sick. A barrel of rum could last for years, which is more than you could say for pretty much anything else on the ship except maybe the hardtack, and nobody was excited about that. The average pirate ship in the 1700s carried about 3 gallons of beer per person per week. That's roughly 900 gallons of beer for a crew of 300, enough to make modern spring break look tame. The beer wasn't just for fun, though. It was often safer to drink than water. Plus, it provided calories and some nutrients. Pirates basically invented the liquid lunch, though their version was a bit more extreme than today's business lunch with wine. Rum storage was a whole different game. It was kept in special barrels, often marked with elaborate codes to indicate quality and origin. The best rum was usually stored in the captain's cabin, which makes sense. When you're in charge of a bunch of rowdy pirates, you definitely need a drink. The regular crew's rum was stored in the hold, carefully rationed out to prevent what ship logs delicately referred to as excessive maritime enthusiasm. The rationing system was surprisingly sophisticated. Each crew member typically got a daily allowance of about half a pint of rum or a gallon of beer. This amount was carefully calculated to keep everyone just happy enough to work, but not so happy they'd fall out of the crow's nest. Some captains would water down the rum, a practice that probably led to more than a few heated discussions about proper beverage management. The most entertaining part of alcohol storage was the elaborate security systems pirates developed to protect it. Some ships had multiple locks on the alcohol storage area, with different crew members holding different keys. It was like a nuclear launch sequence, but for booze. You needed the first mate, the quartermaster, and sometimes even the ship's cook to all agree before anyone could access the main rum supply. This probably led to some interesting negotiations. I'll trade you my rum key for a week of not having to eat the hardtack. But even with all these precautions, creative pirates always found ways to sneak extra drinks. There are actual historical records of pirates drilling tiny holes in rum barrels and using straws made from bird feathers to sample the goods. One particularly clever crew reportedly trained a monkey to sneak into the storage area and pass bottles through a small hole, though this story might have been enhanced by the storyteller having enjoyed a bit too much of the product in question. All this careful alcohol management wasn't just about keeping the crew happy, it was about survival. When you're stuck at sea for months, watching the water supply turn into something that looks like it could develop consciousness, knowing there's a backup supply of drinkable liquid can be pretty comforting. And speaking of comfort, pirates did have one other source of fresh food that didn't come in a barrel or require rationing, because it was walking around on deck. Yes, pirates basically turned their ships into floating farms, complete with chickens strutting about like they owned the place and goats trying to eat everything that wasn't nailed down. A typical pirate ship might carry dozens of chickens, a handful of goats, and several pigs, creating what must have been the world's least peaceful petting zoo. The deck probably sounded like old MacDonald's farm gone rogue, with chickens squawking at midnight and goats bleating their opinions about the ship's direction. Archaeological records from a recovered 1718 pirate ship showed evidence of at least 30 different livestock pens, meaning their deck looked less like a fearsome pirate vessel and more like a barnyard with cannons. The genius of this system was its efficiency. These animals were basically living leftover converters, happily munching away on food scraps that would otherwise go to waste. Chickens would eat practically anything, making them the garbage disposals of the high seas. Goats were even better. They'd eat the actual garbage if no one stopped them. Some historical accounts mention goats eating ropes and parts of sails, leading to new ship rules about keeping the goats away from anything important to staying afloat. But the champions of shipboard livestock was the humble pig. These creatures were like walking storage containers that could turn kitchen scraps into bacon, a transformation that probably seemed like magic to hungry sailors. A single pig could provide enough meat for several days' worth of meals, and in the meantime, it was perfectly happy eating whatever fell on the deck. The feeding system was surprisingly organized. Kitchen scraps were collected in special buckets, marked so no one would accidentally use them for drinking water, though after a few months at sea, some might have preferred the bucket of pig slop to their actual water rations. The animals were fed on a strict schedule, which was probably the only organized thing about pirate life besides drinking and sword waving. Ships would often start their voyages with way more animals than they needed for immediate food. They gradually worked their way through the livestock as other food supplies dwindled. It was like a really grim countdown timer. When the last chicken was served for dinner, everyone knew they'd better find a port soon. The livestock area had its own hierarchy, too. Chickens got the prime real estate near the middle of the ship where their cages would stay drier. Goats, being hardier, got stuck wherever they'd fit. Pigs usually ended up near the back of the ship for reasons that should be obvious to anyone who's ever been downwind of a pig pen. One of the biggest challenges was keeping predators away from the livestock. Rats were a constant menace, and ship's cats, while great for rat control, sometimes got ideas about fresh chicken dinner. There are actually records of pirate ships having designated chicken guards, probably the least intimidating job title in pirate history. The end of the livestock was usually celebrated with a feast, though it must have been a bittersweet celebration. After months of hearing these animals every day, the ship probably felt eerily quiet once they were gone. Plus, no more fresh eggs or milk meant back to the usual menu of salted everything and hardtack. When the last chicken clucked its final cluck, pirates knew they were in for a long stretch of preserved provisions, unless luck and fair winds brought them to a friendly port soon.